North and South Korea are now radically different countries. But their division did not begin with an ancient border. It began with a line drawn in 1945 by outside powers, without Koreans being consulted. That line was not originally intended to become a permanent political division. The Korean War stopped in 1953, but it ended with an armistice, not a peace treaty. So how did one peninsula become two countries? And why did a temporary line survive long enough to shape generations of lives? There are three ways to look at this division. The first is a Korean story. A country emerging from colonial rule, expecting independence, only to be divided without its people being consulted. The second is a Cold War story. Temporary Soviet and American occupation zones hardening into rival political systems as cooperation between the two powers collapsed. And the third is a Korean civil conflict story. Koreans were not passive pieces on a superpower chessboard. The years before the Korean War included political repression, uprisings, migration, and armed clashes near the border. All three are important, but they do not blur one crucial fact. The documented full-scale war began when North Korean forces attacked across the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950. To understand the division, start before North Korea and South Korea existed. Japan annexed Korea in 1910 and ruled the peninsula for 35 years. During World War II, the Allies promised that Korea would become free and independent in due course. That phrase left a lot unresolved. When exactly would independence happen? Who would oversee the transition? What kind of government would emerge? Then, in August 1945, Japan's defeat suddenly became imminent. The Soviet Union entered the war against Japan, and Soviet forces moved into northern Korea. The Allies needed an immediate arrangement for accepting the surrender of Japanese forces on the peninsula. Under pressure, American officials proposed a line, the 38th parallel. Soviet forces would accept the Japanese surrender north of it. American forces would do the same in the south. Stalin accepted the proposal. The 38th parallel was a line of latitude. It was not an old cultural boundary. It did not separate two historic Korean nations. Why choose that line? It worked as a temporary surrender boundary, but strategic concerns also mattered. Soviet forces were already advancing. The proposal also reflected American concern that Soviet forces could take control of the entire peninsula. The key point is that the line was selected quickly under wartime pressure by outside powers. Koreans were not consulted. At first, the division was not presented as a permanent border. The Soviet Union and the United States still formally discussed a unified Korea. A December 1945 agreement called for a joint commission and a period of trusteeship. But the post-war alliance was breaking down. The Soviet Union and the United States increasingly saw each other as rivals. Their joint commission failed to produce a unified political settlement. A temporary line began to harden. By 1947, the Korean question had moved to the United Nations. The UN General Assembly called for elections under the supervision of a temporary commission. But Soviet authorities prevented that commission from entering the northern zone. Elections went forward in the South in May 1948. On August 15, 1948, the Republic of Korea was inaugurated in the South. Less than a month later, on September 9th, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was proclaimed in the North. One peninsula now had two rival states. Both claimed legitimacy over Korea. Neither treated the division as a natural or permanent solution. This is where the decolonization story and the Cold War story meet. Korea had just emerged from Japanese colonial rule. But instead of choosing a single political future, it became divided into two systems backed by competing superpowers. That still does not mean Koreans had no agency. Political conflict within Korea was real. Different groups had sharply different visions of the country's future. The occupation zones did not create two simple, politically uniform camps. Between 1948 and 1950, the peninsula was already violent. There was repression. There were uprisings. People crossed the border. Armed clashes occurred near the 38th parallel. One academic account describes some of these clashes as approaching Civil War intensity. That history matters because the Korean War did not emerge from a perfectly calm background. But careful context is not the same as false equivalence. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces launched a full-scale attack across the 38th parallel into the Republic of Korea. UN Security Council Resolution 82 described it as an armed attack on the Republic of Korea by forces from North Korea and called for their withdrawal to the 38th parallel. Earlier violence explains the road to war. It does not make the start of the full-scale invasion unknowable. The North Korean advance moved rapidly south. 2 days after the attack began, the UN Security Council recommended assistance to repel it and restore peace. A U.S.-led UN command intervened on the South Korean side. After the Incheon landing, UN command forces reversed the initial advance and moved north. Then forces from China entered the conflict under the name Chinese People's Volunteer Army. The war was rooted in Korea's division and Korean political conflict. But it was also now an international war, tied directly to the larger Cold War. The battlefield shifted dramatically. Forces moved south, then north, then south again. Eventually, the front stabilized near the area where the Military Demarcation Line remains today. On July 27, 1953, military commanders signed the Korean Armistice Agreement. An armistice stops fighting. It is not the same thing as a peace treaty. The agreement created a Military Demarcation Line, or MDL, based on the final line of contact. Each side withdrew 2 kilometers, creating the 4-kilometer-wide demilitarized zone, the DMZ. This is an easy detail to miss. Today's DMZ is not simply the original 38th parallel. It runs near that line, but it is a later boundary shaped by the war itself. The Republic of Korea was not a signatory to the armistice. The agreement was signed by military commanders representing the United Nations Command, the Korean People's Army, and the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. Peace talks in Geneva failed to produce a formal peace treaty in 1954. The war had stopped. The political conflict had not been resolved. That unresolved ending matters because the present division is not simply a settled border. It is a frozen front line created by an armistice. The division also became personal. Families were separated by a line that hardened into rival states and then a battlefield. For many people, this was not an abstract geopolitical argument. It meant losing contact with relatives and not knowing what happened to them. The temporary arrangement also became durable enough that, on September 17, 1991, North Korea and South Korea were separately admitted to the United Nations. That is a striking endpoint. The Soviet Union collapsed only a few months later. But by then, Korea's division no longer depended on the Soviet Union alone. 2 rival states had existed for more than 4 decades. A war had created a military frontier. Separate institutions and security arrangements had taken root. And in December 1991, North and South Korea signed an agreement focused on reconciliation, non-aggression, exchange, and cooperation. That suggests a useful way to think about the post-Cold War period. The Soviet collapse removed one of the original forces behind the division. It did not erase the political realities the division had created. In 1945, the 38th parallel was drawn as a hurried surrender line. By 1948, it had helped produce 2 rival states. By 1953, the war had created a different military line nearby. And by 1991, both states had seats at the UN. Korea's division was not inevitable. It was not an ancient split, and Koreans did not originally choose the line. But the line lasted because several forces reinforced each other. An interrupted decolonization, a collapsing alliance between the United States and Soviet Union, competing Korean political movements, and a war that stopped without a final settlement. The missing context is not that the history is too complicated to understand. It is that one temporary line, drawn in a moment of crisis, became a political reality that outlived the people who drew it.